Friday mornings are not easy, so thank you so much. I appreciate everyone. So we have a wonderful panel on the Balkans now. This is the first panel of the day and the panel 3. Our first presenter is Harun Karčić. And let me introduce Harun Karčić to you. Harun Karčić is an executive producer of current affairs on Al Jazeera's Balkans. Over the past decade, he has covered a wide range of events for and reported from Europe and Turkey and the Middle East. Harun has also written numerous academic articles on Islam in post-communist Bosnia and Herzegovina and the role played by foreign powers in the region. Harun is also a presenter on his own show, and I'm curious about that now. So please join me in welcoming Harun Karčić.
Well, good morning to all of you. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for having me here. So my connection with the Abu Sulayman Center is quite personal. As during the war in Bosnia back in the 1990s, I ended up being a refugee in Macedonia, in Turkey, and eventually in Kuala Lumpur, where my late father was a professor at the International Islamic University in Kuala Lumpur, and where Abu Sulayman was director. So I knew him quite well personally, and also knew individuals such as Sayyid Naqib al-Attas and the rest. And then, of course, my mother happened to have been working in the Gazi Husrev Library, one of the oldest libraries in the Balkans, established by Gazi Husrev in the 15th century. And talking about manuscripts, this is something we went through on a daily basis. Another individual, my uncle, was the famous director of the Gazi Husrev Library. He was the person who saved those manuscripts during the war. We'll be talking about that in a while. So I'm a journalist, but also have quite an academic background. So I'll be talking to you about the destruction of Islamic cultural heritage sites in Bosnia during the 1992-1995 war, and the role played by foreign Muslim countries in renovating these destroyed sites. So for most of you who are not very familiar with the Balkan region, Balkan mosques were mostly built in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. They are very simple compared to, let's say, the Grand Ottoman mosques of Istanbul. They are simple in the sense that they have a single minaret, and the ones in more rural areas are made of wood, like the one in the far right corner. Those that you see here are in the urban areas. During the war, and another example is this mosque on the Serbian-Macedonian border, which was built in 1380. Now pay attention to the year. This was much earlier than, this was before the conquest of Istanbul. So Islam had arrived in the Balkans before it had arrived even in Istanbul. The famous Hoxha Mehmed Beg mosque in Tabalabaze. And during the war in 1980 to 1995, the war was a result. You see, Europe was going through a very tumultuous period, right? We had the collapse of communism, we had the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and we had the disintegration of Yugoslavia. Now, the disintegration of Yugoslavia coincided with the rising nationalism among Serbs, Croats, and to a small extent among Bosnians and Albanians. However, the Serbian grand idea, it was an irredentist aspiration, was to create a greater Serbia which would encompass other areas and in a way violently expel what remained of Balkan Muslims. And Balkan Muslims such as myself, Bosniaks or Albanian Muslims, we are still seen by neighboring Serbia and Croatia as the physical remnants of the much detested Ottoman Empire. And this is a process, the famous Eastern question, which is still in the process of being solved. And every now and then you have certain minorities, be they from Greece, from Bulgaria, the famous excursion of Bulgarian Pomaks in 1989, or the expulsion of Bosnian Muslims and Kosovo Albanians. So at every given stage, significant numbers of Balkan Muslims would be expelled towards Turkey. So we are still, as what Huntington called the bloody borders of Islam. We are the northernmost border of the former Ottoman Empire. And so during the war in Bosnia, about 614 mosques were completely destroyed by Serbian and Croatian forces. And it's interesting that these two forces, Bosnian Serbs and Bosnian Croats, aided and abetted by Serbia and Croatia proper, they fought each other, but also primarily focused their war efforts on Bosnian Muslims or Bosniaks. So apart from these mosques, which were completely bulldozed, they also destroyed significant numbers of turbas and caravansarais and hammams and madrasas throughout the country. Now the question came during the war: how do you preserve what's left of it? And it boiled down to individuals who had the courage and the vision to try and save what was left. But before we move on, let me just also show you a famous picture of the Sarajevo City Hall, the Vijećnica, which it was bombed by Bosnian Serb forces, and it had one of the oldest collections of manuscripts and documents from the Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, and Yugoslav period. And about 2 million books and manuscripts were burned within about 6 or 7 days. People who were in Sarajevo, I was a refugee, so I fled to Macedonia as I was an 8-year-old. But my family had stayed there. They said, the building kept on burning for 3 days. When you walked around Sarajevo, you could find small pieces of paper with Arabic script flying through the air. You could probably pick it out from your hair, because these books kept on burning for 3 days in a row. So when my uncle, Dr. Mustafa Yahic, and this is a very interesting documentary. By the way, as you know, I worked at Al Jazeera, and this was produced just in 2010 before I began working at Al Jazeera. It's called The Love of Books. It's an excellent documentary about my uncle and how he and his team saved Sarajevo's the Gazi Husebek library and their books. So during the war, when my uncle saw that the library was being burned, the University Library of Sarajevo, which was housed in the city hall, he took his own car and they found some old banana boxes, and he and his friends went to the Gazi Husebek library during the night, and they picked up all those old Ottoman era manuscripts, packed them in those banana boxes, and drove them to the individual homes to try and secure them. On the way, they were stopped by local gangsters, and they said, "Hey, we have nothing to eat, and you guys are eating bananas." They said, "No, it's not bananas. These are Islamic manuscripts." And when they opened up, they saw these Arabic letters. They said, "Okay, go ahead." And my uncle said that because the Serbian forces were already targeting the Gazi Husebek library, they took old blankets, dipped them in water, and sort of wrapped. They must have damaged those manuscripts, but they tried to wrap these boxes around wet blankets so that they didn't get burnt. And they saved quite a significant number. Actually, the entire collection was saved, except for some books that remained in the library. So he took some of these books to his house. Other employees took parts of those, just different books and manuscripts to their homes. And some were stored in the central bank of Sarajevo. They had this underground vaults, and so the entire collection was preserved. So this is to get a glimpse of how it happened. This is a pretty good documentary. And this is my uncle. He was a long-time director from 1980s until 2010, I believe, almost 30 years. So when he was, so we were living in Kuala Lumpur, and the first time he came to Kuala Lumpur was in 1995, when the war was raging. And my father introduced him to, this is him and Abu Sulayman, with his famous pacemaker, which he always wore. So when he introduced my uncle to Abu Hamid, Abu Hamid connected him with some people, and they provided him money and funds to buy those old, back then this was the most sophisticated thing you could find, those small cameras for microfilming. So my uncle had to smuggle somehow in his bags, because you couldn't enter Sarajevo through the airport. You had to fly to Zagreb, then take a bus, and then you had to go under the underground tunnel to be able to reach Sarajevo. So he took his first microfilming equipment in 1985, and they began microfilming those manuscripts which he stored in his house and in the central bank's vault. And also he again came afterwards in 1996 to Malaysia. And my dad introduced him to this gentleman in the back. This is Sayyid Naqib Al-Atas, the founder of ISTAC. This is a picture from some PhD defense, but I found it in our home, in our family collection. And Al-Atas was, he was very sympathetic towards the Bosnian cause, and of course he connected my uncle to the Al Furqan Foundation, and he also provided some funds and some know-how to his team, and began slowly after the war. So the first phase was the immediate preservation of manuscripts. In 1996, 1997 onwards, when the war in Bosnia ended, my uncle used his connections to my dad to reach Mohammed Abu Sulayman and Al-Atas, and to try and educate Bosnian library staff to begin preserving manuscripts, repairing old manuscripts, and microfilming old manuscripts. So this procedure, this was the period, I believe, from 1996 until maybe 2005, 2010. So it was a pretty long period. My mom worked in the library for about 30 years, so this show us kept on talking about different groups of people coming in and microfilming. And then we come back to the old debate of yesterday: should we microfilm, digitalize, old manuscripts, or are we giving away our cultural heritage? It's a never-ending debate. And this is the Gazi Library today. Now we come back to the foreign factors that played a role in the renovation. So, mosques and Islamic cultural heritage in Bosnia was destroyed. First of all, it was primarily neglected during the 50 years of communism, when the government had we had state-sponsored atheism. Which was, again, far milder than what my colleagues went through in Albania or what our friends went through in Central Asia under Bolshevism, which lasted much longer, I believe, for almost 80 years. Nevertheless, practicing Muslim families such as my own were closely followed by the secret police. You were questioned if you went to, my dad was a professor of Islamic law, so he was questioned quite often by the police, and his contacts with every time you publish an article somewhere abroad, or if you go to travel to Turkey or elsewhere, you'll be questioned by the secret police of what you did, who your contacts, and so on and so forth. So after the war, because there was no money from the local government, foreign Muslim countries stepped in. You had the Saudis initially, you had Kuwait, you had organizations such as Al Furqan that helped, that donated money and funds for the reconstruction of mosques, madrasas, the publishing of books, and also the preservation of manuscripts. Now, Qatar gave a lot of money for this new library, which was created, and this is in the center of Sarajevo. This is how it looks like today. It's pretty big. It's a wonderful building, and this is another example. Then we can talk about how foreign countries, when they donated money for the reconstruction of old mosques, how they also, apart from how they more often than not, they introduced their own new styles of architecture into the Balkans. This is an example of a mosque built in Croatia, in Rijeka, which is, you can see how it's completely, how it's very much different from the traditional mosques of the Balkans. But then again, sometimes you don't really have a choice. If the small Muslim congregation in Rijeka doesn't have the funds to build its own mosque, you accept whatever you're given. And if you bear in mind that the United States will not fund your mosque and the European Union will not do it, well, then you have what you have, right? And this, then we have, so in the initial whole 4 years, this was my specialty during my master's and PhD thesis. I focused mostly on how foreign Muslim countries disseminated their own interpretations of Islam. So we looked at Saudi Salafism, Kuwaiti interpretations of Salafism, Iranian Shia attempts at gaining followers in the Balkans, and also individual organizations such as the Third World Relief Agency, Al Haramain, the Benevolence International, Al Quds Foundation. And then in 2010-11 onwards, when the AK Party became much more present and proactive in the Balkans, we had Tika stepping in, and this is, from my perspective, something which is really welcome. This is a mosque, the Ferhat Pasha Mosque, Ferhat Dia in Banja Luka, which was completely renovated by Tika. So Tika brought its own experts, calligraphers, architects. They found old copies in the Ottoman archives, old copies, drawings of the mosque, and they rebuilt it exactly as it was. In fact, Ahmed Davutoğlu, it was his last trip before he left office as prime minister. He opened this mosque officially. I believe it was probably 2012, 13, I don't know, we can check that. So this is Turkey. This is why many people in Bosnia like to see Turkish presence in the Balkans. If you compare this to mosques built by Kuwait, by Gulf countries in general, these mosques are more often than not very white, boxy, without any calligraphy, nothing whatsoever. And inside that you'll find a lot of Salafi literature, fatwas by Albani, by most of those leading scholars. The Turks are quite different in the sense that they will just build you a mosque, renovate it, and hand over the keys to the official Islamic community in Bosnia. Now, the difference between Bosnia or the United States is that in Bosnia we have an official Islamic, it's called the Islamic Community of Bosnia, very comparable to the Diyanet, except that the Diyanet is state-funded, we are funded by our own individual contributions, and the Diyanet has about 80,000 employees altogether. I think it has the second biggest budget after the Ministry of Defense, and the Islamic community in Bosnia is much more humbler. The Islamic community controls effectively by law all mosques in the country. So sometimes it's funny for me, when I watch U.S. news channels and they say there's this radical mosque in the U.S. which is funded by the Saudis. I mean, in Bosnia, a foreign country or a foreign organization can never fund a mosque. They can physically build a mosque, but they cannot operate it. The Islamic community appoints its own imams, muezzins and everything else, and that's about it, Foreign actors can publish books and disseminate them and organize summer schools and seminars, but this had its peak until 9/11. I think after the 9/11 attacks, the U.S. Treasury Department began really scrutinizing all funds which were sent from the Gulf to the Balkans, and this was mostly slashed. So Turkey is a new actor. It's a welcome actor, and I was quite surprised yesterday. I had lunch with a gentleman from the ODNI, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, who's actually in charge of covering the Balkans, and he looks at Turkey as a welcome partner in the Balkans, and he hopes the new administration will outsource some state building activities to Turkey, which is an interesting moment for me. And this is another mosque in Mostar in Herzegovina, which was also destroyed this time by the Croatian forces. It was rebuilt by Tika. So now bear in mind, it's not always when we say it was rebuilt by Turkey, it can be rebuilt by Tika, the Turkish development agency comparable to USAID. It can be built by Diyanet, which has its own funds, or it can be sort of a town. Like there's a mosque in like the town of Kayseri that donated funds for the building of a new mosque in the Bosnian city of Gorazde. So individual towns or municipalities can donate funds for the construction of mosques. So this was a mosque. You can see that the Turkish investors they adhered to the original drawings of this mosque, which was rebuilt in the city of Mostar. And this is this is the famous or the infamous King Fahd Mosque in Sarajevo, which was opened in 2005. So Saudi Arabia played quite a significant role during the war. They formed this semi-governmental organization called the Saudi High Committee for Helping Bosnia, which was led by then Prince Salman. And all these Western journalists, when they come to Bosnia, they spend 2 days in Sarajevo to write a book about Islamic radicalism in the country. This is the picture that they most often cite and showcase to their friends. So this is the King Fahd Mosque, which is right next to the Saudi Cultural Center. So they were under the impression that this is where Saudi Arabia disseminates its Salafism in the region, and they train fighters and so on and so forth, which is absolute rubbish. So the mosque was built by the Saudis. It was handed over to the Islamic community immediately. There are booklets here on Salafism. I did my master's degree research, but this is a different building. It belongs to the Saudi diplomatic mission, not to the mosque. So you can see this mosque has it's quite different from the other Ottoman era mosques. There's no calligraphy. There's nothing of that sort. And of course, there's no celebration of Mawlud or Mawlid in the mosque. This is a novelty. This is bid'ah. This is an example of a traditional Bosnian mountain mosque built using wood. It's very simple. These mosques they need no foreign funding because they're very simple to build, right? If you want to build a large-scale mosque, you need to get funds from abroad. This was built by local Bosnian Muslims. This is another example of another mosque in Travnik. This is when we talk about foreign countries. It's not always the Gulf states that build the mosques in Bosnia. This is a mosque built by Indonesia. Again, quite different from the other architectural styles, but also bear in mind, I should have shown you the map of Sarajevo. When during the war in Bosnia, Bosnian Muslims initially they were always a majority, and they were dispersed throughout the entire country, co-living with their fellow Serbs and fellow Croats. During the war, they were mostly concentrated to about 25% of the territory, and to the towns of Sarajevo, Tuzla, Zenica, and that's about it. So we had, and at the same time, the cities and villages from where they were expelled, their mosques were destroyed. So you had a twofold event happening here. You had the reconstruction of destroyed mosques in their areas from where Bosnian Muslims were expelled, and you had the construction of new mosques as a necessity in areas where Muslims were now internal migrants, right, or internally displaced people. Like in the suburb of Sarajevo, where I live, Vogošća, these are mostly Muslims, internally displaced Muslims, IDPs from eastern parts of Bosnia who were expelled in 1932, 1935, and they've been living there for about 30 years, and there's not a snowball's chance in hell that they will ever go back their country, to their former places of, to the areas from where they were expelled, because this is the Republic of Srpska and it's no longer their territory. This is the and this is another mosque built by an example of Saudi architecture by the Princess Jafra Mosque in Bugojno, in a different part of Bosnia. So this is a princess who herself donated money. She apparently had a dream that she should build a mosque on the border of Islam. So she said, okay, what is the border of Islam? They said Bosnia is one of the borders of Islam. Yeah, probably have like more Muslims living in Paris than in Sarajevo. But anyways, so she built a mosque. You see, it's quite different. The style is quite different from what we have seen so far. And yeah, so Bosnia has been going through perhaps a triple transition from communism to democracy, from war to peace, from planned economy to liberal economy or capitalist economy, and of course, with all these, with the effects of globalization, we saw new actors making their way into the region. This is not something specific for Bosnia or for the Balkan region. If you speak to people from the Caucasus or from Central Asia, they went through the same script. So the Saudis, the Turks, and the Iranians also tried to make inroads into Central Asia. In certain countries, like in Tajikistan, Iran had far more success because of the similarities when it comes to language. In other areas, not as much. In Azerbaijan, as you know, the Azeris are very close to Israel, so Iranians didn't really make much inroads. They tried similarly in Albania and in Kosovo. My colleague will talk about it more. It's questionable to what extent they really succeeded. The best way to describe these attempts at foreign influences is to use Kerim Öktem's phrase, the Wahhabi intermezzo. So you get this period of, it was like a pendulum effect. People going from communism to democracy, and then slowly making their way, find the middle ground after about 20 years. So now we see in Bosnia, so there is a general religious revival in Europe, in Eastern Europe, after the collapse of communism. And most of you have been dealing with other areas, and you might not have paid as much attention to this region as we do. So there was a genuine religious revival immediately in the 1990s. But then again, after a while, people got, it has somewhat moderated itself over the years. There were foreign actors which made their ways. This was under a lot of scrutiny in the post 9/11 years. Now I believe the Balkan Muslims in general, just like Central Asian Muslims, are slowly discovering their old roots and their old interpretations of Islam. Somebody yesterday asked me, Paul asked me, like, how will they come back to their traditional interpretations of Islam if all these manuscripts were destroyed? Well, a lot of their practices were handed down through oral history. People had this understanding of practice everyday Islam, but they perhaps couldn't speak about it as openly as in other countries. I came across this detail that when the regime of Enver Hoxha collapsed in Albania, the only people who knew how to pray were those who went to a madrasa in 1944, 45. So they were like in the late 70s already, In the case of Bosnia, there was only one madrasa was operational. Before there were about 56, I think, before communism. So it was really restricted. So we are going through this different transition. These are the effects of globalization. Just like we have Jehovah's Witnesses in Bosnia, we have different other groups very much present. But people are rediscovering their old roots, and they're slowly standing up to foreign influences. And now, of course, Turkey is being seen as a welcome partner, because it comes in to renovate destroyed heritage. It helps you, it transfer know-how. It provides a lot of scholarships for Bosnians to study in Turkey. Like my mom's library, the Gazi Surbek Library, they send a lot of their conservationists? Conservators. They sent a lot of those guys to the Slemania Library in Istanbul to get their training. So this is where Turkey steps in. I think that's about it. If you guys have any questions, I would love to answer them, or maybe we can wait for...
We will take the questions at the very end for everybody.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. As words. You know, the discussant is Turkish, that's why he's praising Turkish people. And Turkish people have very special love for Bosnia, I should say, yeah. Okay, so we have Amir Maslu and Ajdin Muhedinović with us. And let me introduce them as well. Amir Maslu is a PhD student at the Department of History, specializing in 19th and 20th century history of Bosnia and Herzegovina. His research interest is primarily the history of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Southeast European region in the late Ottoman period, the perception of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th and 20th centuries, the development of historical thought among Muslim intellectuals in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Ajdin Muhedinović is a historian specializing in the history of Bosnia and Herzegovina during the 19th and 20th centuries. And he obtained his master's degree from the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Sarajevo in 2018. And then he's currently pursuing a PhD at the same institution, focusing on Bosnia and Herzegovina's history. His academic interests include Muslim politics during the war, the activities of Muslim organizations, and the social position of Muslim women in the first half of the 20th century. The title of their talk today is The Demolition of Muslim Religious Objects During the War in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Their Restoration in the Early 21st Century. They will join us through the Zoom today. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you for the nice. Do you hear me? Yep. Thank you for the nice introduction, and I'm glad and grateful to the host of the conference for the opportunity to speak at this event. But first, I would like to inform you that our colleague Amr Maslow is unfortunately unable to attend the conference today due to a personal loss in his family. So I will try to present his and my part of the presentation. I just need to share the presentation. Do you see it?
Not yet. I just gave you permission to share.
Okay. And now it should be.
We can see it now. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. As you have heard, our topic is the demolition of Muslim religious objects during the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, 1992-1995, and their restoration in the early 21st century. At the end of February and the beginning of March 1992, a referendum on the independence of Bosnia and Herzegovina was held. The citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina chose independence and to leave Yugoslavia. Such an outcome resulted in aggression against Bosnia and Herzegovina during the period of 1992-1995. Here you have some kind of historical land that shows the process of dissolving of the breakup of Yugoslavia from how 1990 when the Slovenian independence referendum was held, also Croatia, Macedonia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. The aggression was carried out by the armies of Bosnian Serbs and Bosnian Croats, with continuous assistance and involvement from neighboring states, Yugoslavia, later Serbia and Montenegro, and the Republic of Croatia. During the war, various crimes, ethnic cleansing and genocide were committed against the Muslim population. Most notable was the genocide in Srebrenica in 1995. Carried out by the Bosnian Serb army. This slides in a photo includes a photo of Bosnian Muslim detains. Also, several other photos such as mass grave in Srebrenica and Srebrenica Memorial Park, which you can see. The number of people killed in 1995 genocide comes about 8,000 people, mostly men and young boys. We have here a picture of Radovan Karadžić, who was a president of Republika Srpska, who held a sentence life in prison for genocide and other war crimes. One also important person in this story was General Ratko Mladić. In addition to the large human casualties, the cultural heritage of Bosnia and Herzegovina was also heavily damaged. At the very beginning of the war in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the National Library and Oriental Institute were set on fire, destroying numerous manuscripts and archival materials. Displayed on this slide are the burned City Hall and the Oriental Institute, along with a photo of the murdered librarian Aida Buturović. At the time, in areas occupied and controlled by the Serbs, mosques and other religious buildings were being destroyed. During the war, the Bosnian Serbs army destroyed 534 mosques, while the Bosnian Croat army destroyed 80 mosques. Additionally, over 700 properties owned by the Islamic community of Bosnia and Herzegovina were demolished or damaged. Most of the religious buildings were destroyed in areas where the most severe crimes and genocide were committed between 1992 and 1995. These areas include eastern Bosnia, which are mostly the small cities of Visegrad, Zvornik, Bratunac, Srebrenica, Vlasenica, Foča, and Rogatica, as well as northwestern Bosnia and cities such as Prijedor, Banja Luka, Sanski Most, and Ključ. In the city of Banja Luka alone, 16 mosques were destroyed, including those entered on the UNESCO protected list, such as Ferhadia and Arnaudia mosques. After the war, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague and courts in Bosnia and Herzegovina issued numerous verdicts for war crimes and genocide, particularly against the military and political leadership of Bosnian Serbs and Croats. However, the destruction of religious buildings and other cultural and historical monuments was pushed into the background. One case involving the demolition of a mosque was that of Predrag Kujundžić, who, along with his unit Predini Vukovi or Predini Vols, within the so-called Army of Republika Srpska, occupied a Muslim village in 1992 and demolished a mosque. Predrag Kujundžić was sentenced to 70 years in prison for crimes committed in Doboj, including the demolition of mosque. And on this slide, you can see the picture of this person. In addition to religious building, a significant number of religious officials were also killed during the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. According to data from the Islamic religious community, 97 imams were killed during the war. One of the most brutal killings was the death of Imam Hasi Bramić near Sarajevo. The Bosnian Serbs army first slaughtered his entire family, his wife and 4 children, the youngest of whom was just 4 months old, before killing Hasi Bramić himself. On this slide, we see a photo of Hasi Bramić and his wife Shafika and their children Mohamed, Meliha, and Ahmed. The youngest, Amina, didn't have a photo. Ultimately, during the aggression on Bosnia and Herzegovina, a longer processes continued, referred to in our historiography as the Ottomanization, which began in the 19th century. Nearly every war and conflict involved systematic destruction of Muslim structures, aiming to erase everything connected to the Ottoman period and Islam from public space. Bosnia and Herzegovina was not alone in this experience. In the late 90s, during the war in Kosovo, 1999, and a large number of Albanian mosques were also destroyed. Additionally, the mosque in Niš in Serbia was attacked and damaged several times in 21st century. By signing the peace agreement in Dayton, Ohio, United States of America, the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina officially came to an end. and a phase of restructuring and reorganization of the country began. It could also be said that the process of legalizing war and violence achieved goals was initiated. Bosnia and Herzegovina was divided into two administrative units, with the Republika Srpska, in political terms allocated to the Serbs, while the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, comprising 10 cantons, was allocated to the Bosniaks and Croats together. Additionally, due to its strategic importance, the city of Brčko and its surrounding settlements became the so-called Brčko district, which essentially functions as a condominium of both Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Republika Srpska, operating as a self-governing local area. The purpose of this particular information is to present the complex administrative governance and organizational and legal circumstances that post-war local leaders faced in nearly all aspects of rebuilding the war-torn country, including those responsible for reconstruction of religious buildings. The matter was even more complicated given that the most of the Muslim religious buildings destroyed during the war remained within the territory of Republika Srpska, and areas where systematic efforts were made to prevent the return of the displaced population. This became one of the key criteria of the Islamic religious community for reconstructing war-damaged religious buildings. Therefore, the goal was for these buildings to be rebuilt primarily by the returning population, which would serve as the foundation for restoring life in areas where crimes of ethnic cleansing and genocide had been committed. After the peace agreement, several cities within the entity of Republika Srpska held significant importance due to their historical development and roles during the Ottoman period of Bosnia and Herzegovina's history. For example, Banja Luka served as the seat of the Bosnian Eyalet from 1580, Foča was the seat of Herzegovina Sanjak, Zvornik was the administrative center of the Zvornik Sanjak, and Visegrad functioned as a crucial crossroads connecting to the Ottoman provinces of Bosnia with the rest of the empire. Over the centuries of Ottoman rule, numerous structures of exceptional cultural value were built in these and other towns, representing exemplary works of Ottoman and Islamic architecture in the broader region of Southeast Eastern Europe. Here are some photos of these mosques. The process of reconstruction and renovation of these buildings has been extremely slow and is still ongoing, further highlighting the complexity and resistance present in this process. One of the most representative and symbolic cases was the reconstruction of the Ferhadia Mosque in Banja Luka, the unofficial capital of Republika Srpska. The construction permit for the mosque was not granted until year 2001. The day before the ceremonial laying of the mosque's foundational stone, leaflets appeared in the city with messages such as, "Tomorrow, our city will be attacked by Islamic hordes, aided by criminals from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, who will try once again to sow the seed of Islam in our city." The so-called criminals from the Austro-Hungarian Empire refer to representatives of the European Union and international community who were involved in the process of primarily because their presence was believed to have a claiming effect in the atmosphere charged with nationalism. However, the local population did not. The local Serb population did not perceive the event as a step toward coexistence and normalization, but instead organized resistance. Clashes soon broke out with around 4,000 residents of Banja Luka attacking approximately 300 Muslims. Buses and cars that had brought the Muslims attendees to Banja Luka were set on fire. The gathered Serb crowd chanted, "We don't want a mosque," and Muslim visitors, along with diplomatic and international representatives, found refuge in a nearby Islamic community building, which also was came under attack. There was a lack of timely response from authorities. The Prime Minister of Republika Srpska in that time, Mladen Ivanić, joined the besieged group of Muslims and international representatives only several hours after the incident began. A special police unit eventually surrounded the building and dispersed the angry crowd, which had been throwing stones and other objects. The situation was finally resolved when the special police successfully evacuated the Muslims and international representatives. Despite the riots, the death of a man named Murad Badić and injuries sustained by 153 people, no one was held criminally accountable. Nevertheless, reconstruction of Fahadiyya Mosque was successfully completed. In 2007, the last mosque in Banja Luka to be rebuilt was the Arnaudia Mosque, which was completed in 2024. The ceremonial reopening of both mosques proceeded peacefully and without incidents. In the other part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the situation was significantly different. Bosniaks had substantially influence in government and politics, which allowed them to set the peace and create a favorable environment for the reconstruction of mosques and other religious buildings. The population organized more quickly, and aid flowed more directly and easily from other Islamic countries such as Turkey, Iran, and various Arab nations. Mosques with a significant cultural and historical value were restored and reconstructed using the same principle as those in Republika Srpska, with intention of making them appear as authentic as possible to the original form. However, in certain municipalities, the construction of mosques also served as a means of transforming public space. One example is the construction of a mosque in Ključ, a small municipality in western Bosnia. At the very beginning of the war in 1992, the Muslim population there suffered horrific crimes, with hundreds of civilians killed, the youngest being a 5-month-old baby named Amila Džaferović, who was shot in the head. Nearly the entire Muslim population of about 20,000 people was expelled by the Serbian army. In the final phase of the war, the institutions of Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina regained control over this municipality, as was the case in all municipalities taken over by the Serbs separatist forces during the war. The local mosque and other Muslim religious buildings had been destroyed. After the war, however, Muslim politicians and the local community did not rebuild the mosque on its original pre-war location. In the new circumstances, marked by a shift in paradigms and reinterpretation of the past by nationalist intellectuals that included a negative attitude toward the socialist and communist legacy and its monuments, there was a common practice of demolishing, neglecting, or repurposing monuments and public spaces altogether. In the municipality of Ključ, a memorial park dedicated to the partisan anti-fascist forces of World War II in Yugoslavia was destroyed, and the mosque was built in its place. And if you see this picture of that I took from Google Maps, there are 2 points, the 2 circles. The red is the position of an old mosque, which was in a previous slide. These are that is a picture of demolished mosque in Ključ, and this in the down right corner, this green circle shows the mosque on the left side, which was rebuilt after the war. This one example, though not the only one, that illustrates how the process of reconstructing religious buildings in areas where Bosniaks or Muslims held political power and shaped the post-war dynamics, played a multifaceted role. Among other things, it involved the transformation of public space, its adaptation to new ideological frameworks, and the construction and reconstruction of historical narratives in specific local context. The demolition and destruction of Islamic religious sites did not case with the end of the war. Alongside the reconstruction of these sites, attacks on mosques, Muslim cemeteries, and other Islamic rebuildings have continued and are still occurring. This is especially common during various celebrations in the Republika Srpska entity, often accompanied by an entire choreography that includes the singing of national songs with anti-Muslim themes, the display of banners and posters, and ultimately attack on Islamic religious buildings. In the contemporary context, one can also speak of a process of inventing Islamic terrorism in Bosnia and Herzegovina, a process in which local Serbian and Croatian politicians are trying to label Bosniaks only as Muslims and link them to Islamic terrorism in order to weaken their political position and influence in Europe. This approach aims to shape international perception of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Bosniak people. That this narrative finds fertile ground in certain European countries is most clearly demonstrated by Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who has repeatedly expressed negative views toward Bosniaks. Notably in 2021, he stated that Bosnia and Herzegovina cannot become part of the European Union because the challenge lies in how to integrate 2 million of Muslims into the European Union. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. This was another very interesting presentation. I'm learning a lot today. Thank you everyone so much. So we have our last presenter with us, Besnik Sinani. Am I pronouncing this correctly? Okay, let me introduce Besnik Sinani, everyone. Dr. Besnik Sinani is a research fellow at the Center for Muslim Theology, Tübingen University since January 2022. He holds a PhD in History and Islamic Studies from the Department of History and Cultural Studies at Freie Universität Berlin. Dr. Sinani has also earned an MA in Near East Studies from New York University and a BA in International Studies and History from the City University of New York. His research experience includes a postdoctoral fellowship at the Leibniz Zentrum Moderner Orient and a previous position as a research fellow at the same institution. He has received several prestigious awards, including the Davo Dissertation Award in 2021 and the Franz Tyson Foundation Fellowship in 2020 and 2021. Dr. Sinani has been further recognized with fellowships from the German Federal Excellency Program and the US Department of State. The title of his talk today is Out of the Cave, The Many Lives of Surviving Islamic Artifacts in Post-Communist Albania. Everyone join me in welcoming Dr. Besnik Sinani.
All right, thank you very much to everyone at the Abu Sulayman Center for this amazing conference and for inviting me and making me part of this amazing conference. I have to start with a disclaimer. It's like my day job. I usually deal with the Sufis in Saudi Arabia, but here I am actually talking about this is my side project. For a year now, I'm with a group of friends. We embarked into this project of opening a museum of Islamic heritage with artifacts that have survived the communist period in Albania. Now, as I'm going to try to make the case, is that actually I'm not a believer in museums, or not at least when it comes to housing religious objects in museums. So then what I plan to do here today, and pretty much as a form of hopefully a provocation to kind of pick your brains and get your feedback as a form of unpaid consultancy, is to perhaps to kind of raise the question, why a museum? Especially since I'm claiming that I'm not a big believer in that. And then if I manage to convince you that it's not such a horrible idea, then what kind of narrative would this museum try to or seek to convey? And what kind of tools or what kind of objects would be employed in trying to convey that narrative or that story? So the story of the Sleepers of Ephesus, a group of young men who, according to both Christian and Muslim traditions, took refuge in a cave to escape religious persecution and were miraculously preserved in a state of hibernation, serves as a compelling allegory for the project I'm part of. Upon awakening years or decades or centuries later, who knows, the sleepers emerged as living symbols of divine favor, resilience, and enduring faith. The museum project in Tirana in Albania, dedicated to artifacts that survived the violence of Albania's communist period, draws inspiration from this narrative, which provided the curatorial framework for our inaugural exhibition launched in April 2024, so exactly one year ago. So this was actually kind of part of the poster, and that was a picture of the exhibition. Among the exhibited items were two calligraphic works in the shape of boats, which each inscribed with the names of the Ashab al-Kahf, right, the young man of the cave. This narrative found deeper resonance in the stories of many of the artifacts themselves, objects that were protected by individuals who risked state persecution to preserve them. It resonates also with episodes of silent forms of resistance under communist rule, involving prominent ulema who locked themselves home till the day they died. We know the story of two brothers who literally took their families and they went in the caves to live there in order to preserve their faith. Very recently, there's a publication in Tirana, and one of the stories is a story of a yorganci. Those of you who speak Turkish would recognize the term, a quilt maker, that, he had a very steady kind of regimen of his life of starting the day by praying Sabah or the Fajr prayer in the mosque of the bazaar, and then he would open his shop. And then when both of the mosque was shut down and the old bazaar of Tirana, the capital, was completely demolished, then he found no reason to leave his home, and he actually locked himself home for 40 years. And he left his home only when he died. So there are stories that really resonate with this story, the Quranic story and the Christian story of the Levant, of this the young man of the cave. Yet the collection embodies multiple, often competing narratives of heritage. At its center is a personal commitment of an Albanian imam and a friend of mine, Samir Ismaili, and I'm going to make a point of mentioning their names because I believe that it is worth mentioning their names, who over more than a decade has assembled this collection and now offers it as an endowment to establish a public museum. His own story adds a further layer of complexity. Following a heated sectarian campaign, he was dismissed after 17 years of service as an imam of the Kokonozi Mosque in Tirana due to his affiliation with the Rifai Sufi order. His story is representative of a post-communist dominant Muslim religiosity in Albania, socialized in globalized searches for an authentic Islam of the generation of the Prophet, the Salaf, that sees this heritage with suspicion. Within this religious framework, the artifacts in question, tombstones, manuscripts, talismans, and calligraphy, may be seen not as cherished relics, but as deviations from a presumed orthodoxy. In the process, tombstones have been vandalized, mosques, frescoes scrapped away, and talismans of intricate beauty burned, all in the name of purifying Islam. And I even had a very recent video of someone actually burning talismans, but it is somewhere in my files, and I couldn't find it when I was preparing this presentation, unfortunately, or fortunately. At the same time, the collection includes manuscripts donated by the descendants of a distinguished Ottoman scholarly family whose ancestors served as judges as far as Yemen. So we have, for example, the copy that Imam Yahya donated to his great-grandfather, the copy of the Quran, and his great-grandfather used to read that copy. We have the inscription of that. Imam Yahya of Yemen, of course. So this text points also to an overlooked legacy of Ottoman cosmopolitanism and trans-regional intellectual exchange. Moreover, the museum project brings to the fore the long-standing neglect of Islamic heritage in Albania's post-communist period. Islamic cultural legacies have often been regarded as culturally inferior or incompatible with the country's aspirations towards European integration. And finally, The collection's current vulnerability also speaks to the threat posed by private collectors, mostly foreign, who see such artifacts as commodities rather than elements of a shared cultural patrimony. The very idea of housing these objects in a museum introduces additional conceptual challenges. What does it mean to display devotional objects in a secular institutional space? How is their meaning deciphered? How are objects selected and arranged? Museums, by their very nature, are sites of displacement. And in this case, they also risk reinforcing the processes of violent secularization that originally led to the removal of these items from the context for which they were produced. The Albanian sociologist Enisur Starova has depicted Albanian modernity and the national thought in the wake of Ottoman imperial collapse as an escape from the East in pursuit of acceptance in Europe. This movement encapsulates the dilemma articulated by the French historian Nathalie Cleyer in her analysis of the formation of a Muslim-majority nation within Europe. The history of late 19th and 20th century Balkans has been mentioned here actually by Harun and the others, has been depicted by historians like Justin McCarthy as a story of de-Islamization, following the ethnic cleansing and forced migration of the Muslim population towards Turkey. The end of the Second World War and the communist victory marked the beginning of a new period. In his recent work, a friend of mine, the Montreal-based historian Don Dani, in his book The Sacralization of Politics in Communist Albania, argues that the regime's anti-religious campaign, culminating in 1967 prohibition of religion and codified in the 1976 constitution, represented not only a rejection of religious practice, rather it signaled the emergence of a new quasi-theological form of monotheism. The exiled writer Arship Pipa famously characterized this ideology as a belief system in which there is no God and Enver Hoxha, the dictator, is his prophet. This sacralization of politics profoundly shaped Albania's national narrative, fostering a sense of collective destiny akin to a form of civil or public religion. Thus, the communist regime's anti-religious violence constituted not simply a form of political repression, it represented a form of truth claim with deep cultural ramifications. The anti-religious campaign included political persecution of clergy, persecution of religious practice, and destruction of material culture. One of the most significant campaigns against Muslim heritage in the capital, in Tirana, was the complete demolition of the old bazaar, along with its mosques, the tekas, the churches. Communist propaganda juxtaposed the imagery of collapsing minarets with the rising cranes of socialist modernity, symbolizing the creation of a new city atop the ruins of the old ones. The Dutch art historian Michael Kiel, who managed to secretly sketch a number of Muslim heritage sites before their destruction, documented these events with both scholarly precision and emotional resonance, reflecting on the fate of the Mosque of Pechin, once among the most architecturally impressive Ottoman-era mosques in Albania. He wrote, "From the time of the Cultural Revolution in 1967, I remember the long minarets fallen across the main streets of Shkodra, blocking traffic. Elsewhere, we saw leaflets with instructions on how to demolish minarets. We were not allowed to photograph these leaflets. In 1967, I visited the Mosque of Pechin, still displaying all its glory. By 1978, the mosque had been destroyed, although the courtyard, adorned with beautiful typical Albanian frescoes, had been converted into a coffee house. In 1983, everything had been razed, evidence that the forces of destruction had prevailed over those of preservation. In my studies of Ottoman architecture in Albania," continues Kiel, "I have described the destruction of mosques in places like Kavaja and Pechin as an Aztec barbaric sacrifice in which the priest rips the beating heart from a living body. The destruction encompassed, in addition to mosques, churches, tekas, cemeteries, soup kitchen, madrasas, and libraries. Kiel's dramatic description underscores the symbolic emotional violence of the era's cultural devastation, violence that reverberated far beyond the physical demolition of heritage sites, reshaping the cultural and the religious landscape for the nation for generations to come." While the regime's war on religion was grounded in this Marxist conception of history and scientific progress, the communist politics of cultural heritage in Albania reflected a distinctively Eurocentric view of cultural hierarchies. By 1967, the officially recognized religious monuments under state protection included 9 mosques, one single site affiliated with Sufi orders, none associated with the Bektashi order, which has a large presence in Albania, 117 Orthodox churches, and 10 Catholic churches. Notably, the Pechin or the Mosque of Pechin and Kavaya, referenced by Michael Kiel, were not included among the protected sites. In Tirana, only one mosque from the former Old Bazaar, the Haji Eden Bey Mosque, was spared from demolition. Following the collapse of the communist regime, the widow of the communist dictator Enver Hoxha, herself a prominent political figure and close collaborator, noted in an interview that while the war on religion had indeed been consistent with the regime's revolutionary ideology, certain forms of religious art, particularly Eastern Orthodox icons, were nevertheless recognized for their cultural value. As a result, a former church in the southeastern city of Korça was converted into a museum dedicated to Orthodox iconography. One of the 2 similar museums that remains active to this day. As the Albanian historian and personal friend Eton Hatibi has argued, despite being a militantly anti-religious regime, Albanian communism, even during its autocratic phases in the 1970s and 1980s, invested significantly in maintaining a presence within the broader cultural discourse of the European continent when it came to the use of national cultural assets. Alongside the rigid, ideologically driven construction of a society tailored to the needs of the regime, a more conciliatory approach towards cultural heritage, particularly Eastern Orthodox Christian heritage, can be observed during the period of international isolation. Following a hysterical campaign against religious heritage that culminated in the late 1960s, the subsequent decades witnessed the establishment of several museums that accommodated elements of the country's Orthodox spiritual legacy. Iconographic museums were opened in the cities of Berat and Korça, while a complete wooden iconostasis was installed in the permanent collection of the National Gallery of Figurative Arts in Tirana. This valuable yet culturally and religiously decontextualized heritage was transformed into another window through which the regime sought to communicate with the outside world. An integral component of the communist regime's campaign against religion in Albania was the formation of socialist subjectivities, a modernizing project grounded in key Enlightenment ideals, including the emancipation of individuals from religious belief, the education of the new generation, and the creation of the new socialist man. This endeavor was celebrated as the Communist Party's greatest achievement. Through extensive social engineering, the regime aimed to produce a disenchanted generation, one that would eventually lead the country's post-communist transition. This new elite reflected the worldview of the state-sponsored atheism, and it upheld a Eurocentric value system. This worldview often translated after the fall of communism into a political, if not spiritual, affinity toward Christianity, the religion of Europe, and correspondingly a dismissive or antagonistic attitude toward Muslim spiritual and cultural heritage. This disposition was reinforced by global narratives such as the Clash of Civilizations and the Albanian political and intellectual elite's determination to align the country with the right side of the global political divide. These dynamics contributed to the marginalization of Islamic heritage in post-communist Albania, reflecting broader geopolitical and cultural anxieties about belonging, modernity, and civilizational identity. Relevant to our investigation, this cultural and political orientation is also reflected in the current government's politics of memory, particularly in the allocation of state funds for the restoration of religious heritage sites. This pattern is readily observable in the reports by the National Institute of Cultural Heritage. While notable restoration efforts have been undertaken for Muslim cultural sites, these projects have rarely been funded by the Albanian government's designated public funds or by grants provided by the European Union. Instead, they have often relied on support from the Turkish Cooperation and Coordination Agency, TICA. Now, TICA's approach to restoration, and I don't share my colleagues' enthusiasm about TICA, TICA's approach to restoration merits a separate and more extensive inquiry. as it has attracted criticism regarding both the quality of its work and its sensitivity to original aesthetic elements. Earlier TICA representatives have openly criticized Saudi-funded restoration efforts for attempting to obscure or erase the Ottoman character of historic mosques. However, subsequent TICA-led projects have themselves been subject to similar critiques. Meanwhile, the Albanian government is building 2 museums dedicated to celebrating Jewish life in Albania, all 170 of them. That's the Jewish population of Albania. There is no declared plan to invest in a museum that recognizes the cultural heritage of the majority Muslim population. As foreign visitors to the National Museum in Tirana observe, 5 centuries of Ottoman presence in Albania are absent in the museum. Meanwhile, important surviving cultural sites like the building housing the Ethnographic Museum in Kruja, Tirana, as elsewhere, are depicted as typically Albanian. The Ottoman dimensions in the architecture of entire cities like Gjirokastra or Berat are erased from the official narratives. Now, the dilemmas of the museum. When I first moved to Berlin, and I know that this was mentioned actually yesterday in the, so I'm sorry again to ruin the view. When I first moved to Berlin, a year after the 2015 migration crisis, a friend, an art historian, shared with me an incident that she had witnessed at the Berlin's Museum of Islamic Art. A group of Syrian refugees had been invited to the museum as part of a series of goodwill initiatives designed to foster a sense of welcome in response to growing anti-immigrant sentiment across Germany. The visit happened to coincide with one of the 5 daily prayer times. I mean, it's 5 of them, so it's going to happen at some point. Upon encountering the striking turquoise Konya mihrab on display, a few of the visitors prepared to pray. However, they were promptly stopped by museum staff and informed that prayer was not permitted in that space. This incident highlights the museum's role as a secular institution in which devotional objects are decontextualized, stripped of their original religious function and significance. Such practices often result in the erasure of the intentions and meanings endowed by those who originally commissioned or used these objects. Among the few surviving objects in our institute's collection is a candle holder donated by the daughter of Sulayman Pasha, the founder of the mosque established in 1614, that along with a hammam and a bakery marked the foundation of Tirana as an urban center in the early 17th century. The mosque sustained, so that's the mosque of Sulayman Pasha, and it's not there anymore, of course. The mosque sustained damage during the Second World War and was subsequently demolished under the communist regime. Today, the only remaining monument from the mosque's adjoining cemetery, a solitary monumental tomb, has been absorbed into one of the towering new developments that now dominate Tirana's skyline, serving as a stark symbol of Albania's post-communist neoliberal urban transformation. To the best of my knowledge, the candle holder is the sole material object to have survived from the original mosque complex. In the current political climate shaped by contested real estate interests and the identity politics of post-communist Albania, the possibility of restoring the mosque and returning the candle holder to its original context appears unfeasible. What then is to be done with this object? What forms of care, display, or interpretation might meaningfully engage its historical and spiritual significance, while accounting for the complex cultural and political terrain in which it now exists? The idea of a museum appears as an opportunistic compromise in the absence of restorative options. I do not subscribe to the notion that museumification, as some people have claimed, of religion constitutes a form of reconceptualization equivalent to sacralization. However, the modern museum's primary function as a storyteller presents creative opportunities for engaging the public with sacred narratives. Can a museum then convey the Quranic sacred history that these objects were originally intended to communicate, particularly when they were produced for religious spaces such as mosques or tekas that no longer exist? As museums increasingly strive to become visitor-centered institutions, is it possible for such storytelling to meaningfully engage audiences who may be unfamiliar with the religious traditions represented here? Furthermore, how can a text-based narrative resonate with a public that may no longer recognize the script, comprehend the narratives, or interpret the symbols embedded within these objects. In 2024, the Turkish and Albanian governments officially inaugurated the new Grand Mosque of Namazja in Tirana. Although construction had been completed nearly a decade earlier, the Turkish government, reportedly the primary sponsor and contributing approximately more than $30 million, had delayed the mosque's opening due to its opposition to the Gülen movement, which leads Albania's official Muslim representative body. The mosque was ultimately inaugurated by Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Albania's Prime Minister Edi Rama. It is now administered by a foundation composed of Turkish representatives and Albanian affiliates unaffiliated with the Gülen movement. The original project envisioned the inclusion of a museum of tolerance and a library within the mosque complex, alongside several commercial units and a parking facility intended to support the mosque's financial sustainability. While designated spaces exist, a museum exhibition hall and a two-story library area are there, these components remain as empty spaces due to the withdrawal of the Turkish funding, reportedly owing to budgetary constraints. The Konak Institute, of which I'm a part of for a year now since we established this initiative, proposed using the available space to establish a museum of Islamic art and heritage, and later we actually reconceptualized this as a museum of Muslim life, in exchange for a form of financial compensation through ticket sharing used to support the mosque's upkeep. After 6 months of negotiations, our proposal has neither been formally accepted nor rejected. Setting aside the specifics of those negotiations, our proposal was shaped by the understanding that placing the collection within a mosque complex would return devotional objects to a sacred setting. Moreover, such an institution could potentially offer historical and cultural depth to a newly built mosque that exists within a politically fraught context. Setting aside the question of space, the first exhibition we launched a year ago in a private gallery offered a number of valuable insights. Initially, I was skeptical about the capacity of a post-communist public to engage meaningfully with the material we were presenting. Do not underestimate the public. The curator we collaborated with, Laresha Basha, advised me, and she was ultimately proven right. Public interest exceeded our expectations. Visitors expressed a sense of both vague familiarity and new discovery. The Quranic story of the sleepers of Ephesus, the Ashab al-Kahf, offers a compelling metaphor. Upon awakening, it was the obsolete currency they brought to the market that sparked public curiosity. Similarly, our exhibition invited viewers to encounter objects that, while historically distant, still resonated in meaningful ways. As we continue to await a decision regarding the proposed space, we have remained engaged with the question of storytelling. As Beverly Sterrell has famously argued, audiences respond most effectively to clearly articulated big ideas. The central narrative that these objects were originally meant to convey is the sacred history of humanity, from the primordial covenant with the divine, the Alastu bi Rabbikum moment, to an eschatological future. Even seemingly modest or damaged artifacts bear witness to this overarching story. A delicately embroidered yet almost naive calligraphic inscription on silk of the well-known phrase, Laulaka, Laulaka, if it not for you, O Muhammad, along with several weathered tombstones, speak to this cosmic narrative. A depiction of the feminine Burak, the mythical steed of the Prophet, served as a visual reminder of the Prophet's ascension during the night journey, the Miraj, a spiritual ascent that through prayer remains open to everyone as an invitation. So I find Brent Play's characterization of religion in museums as merely a historical category within human evolution to be, therefore, unsatisfying. Similarly, the grand narrative that religious objects seek to convey needs not to be diminished to the level of spectacle as is often the case in religious theme parks. While it is indeed essential for museums to contextualize objects historically, the narratives these objects were originally intended to communicate often transcend the realm of empirical documentation. In this context, I would also like to problematize Pamela Klassen's assertion that museums narrate religion with an authority that comes from their attempts to distance themselves from religion as secular institutions. Klassen's observation overlooks the potential for museums to engage with religious traditions from within, particularly as Western academia increasingly acknowledges the legitimacy of studying religion from internal perspectives. There is no compelling reason to exclude such approaches in preservation efforts and curatorial initiatives. In this regard, a Swedish scholar, Helena Rangfeldt-Stern, has identified 3 distinct approaches to the presence of religious objects in museums, offering a useful framework for reconsidering how these institutions might more holistically engage with the sacred dimensions of material culture. The first one, she says, is the model built the first model builds on the museum as a killing of previous identities and the objects as provided with new identities as museum objects. The second model is the hybrid identity, where a museum object can possess several identities simultaneously depending on the eyes of the beholder, sacredness, art, object, or evidence of history. The third model is defined by the uses of objects. The metaphor of the sleepers of Ephesus that we have employed deliberately rejects the first of Sturm's models, not only in terms of scholarly methodology, but also in recognition of the history of ideological violence that many of these objects carry with them. The hybrid identity of the museum, as articulated by Sturm, offers a more inclusive and audience-centered framework, one that is less prescriptive in its interpretative stance. This model does not negate the original intention behind the production of religious objects, nor does it alienate those who may not share in the theological or cultural narratives these objects represent. Rather, it affirms an aesthetic and affective dimension that transcends specific doctrinal or cultural boundaries. As Adina Langer observes, modern museums increasingly embrace their educational mission by envisioning a curious, non-expert audience, individuals eager to learn about unfamiliar people, places, and ideas, yet capable of recognizing a shared humanity. The human search for the divine, for transcendence, and for participation in sacred history is a universal impulse, manifested in diverse forms across different historical and cultural contexts. While the objects on display reflect this enduring drive towards sacred meaning, they also point to particular local traditions and historical specificities. Consider, for example, the Albanian flag adorned with a double-headed eagle formed from the Arabic names of the Ahl Bayt, the family of the Prophet. This flag once belonged to Ahmed Shkodra, a Rifai sheikh. Or take the cigarette box engraved with the Bektashi Tugra alongside, if you actually open it, and I should have put that picture there, alongside the engraved image of Stalin. An object that captures the complex entanglements of political ideology and spiritual identity. These are but two of many compelling examples that illuminate the layered histories and hybrid meanings embedded in such artifacts. And there's the last moment. In an interview I gave last year, I saw where she was going. I gave last year on the occasion of the first exhibition of our collection, I sought to emphasize that the objects on display speak not only of beauty and the human search for the divine, but also of a history marked by political violence. The candle holder mentioned earlier, for instance, evokes a memory of the now destroyed mosque and the lives of those who once worshipped there. The question we continue to ask ourselves is how might the future museum we are working toward effectively narrate this history of violence, a history that contextualizes both what has been preserved and what has been lost. To omit this dimension would render the story incomplete and would forego a crucial opportunity for education and reflection. This project remains a work in progress. The story is still being written, and crucially, it is not meant to be finalized. One way we have begun to explore and articulate this narrative is through a new exhibition that actually I was there and we opened only a few weeks ago in Tirana. Intended as a foundational component of the future museum, this exhibition presents a collection of visual materials from communist-era media that were used during the regime's anti-religious campaign to legitimize violence against religious institutions, practices, and communities. These images, part of the regime's indoctrination apparatus, became icons of the communist form of monotheism, a secular faith grounded in ideological absolutism. As several visitors to the exhibition ironically noted, some of the images on display could easily be repurposed by contemporary far-right parties in Europe as part of their Islamophobic rhetoric. The project aimed to prompt critical introspection on the notions, visual representations, and inherited assumptions that continue to shape how Islam and Muslims are perceived and discussed in contemporary Albanian society. What are the potential dangers embedded in political promises of emancipation, modernization, progress, and liberation, ideals so central to the communist narrative and indeed to many ideological descendants of Enlightenment thought? The story of those promises and the violence they produce is embedded in the broader narrative of the Muslim experience that the museum seeks to convey. Storytelling, after all, is rarely about the past alone. It is fundamentally about the creation of meaning, the cultivation of memory, and the invitation to reflect in and for the present. And thank you.